Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is the 16th of July. Today we're going to be doing a full front update. And if you have not seen yet, I have added in the most important rail lines that connect Crimea and also Russia proper to the Russian and Ukrainian front line around Zaporizhia. And so this is just to give everybody a better idea of the logistical situation because again, we have to acknowledge that the Russians are relying a lot to transport their heavy equipment using these rail lines, especially the rail lines from Crimea, but also to a lesser extent the rail lines that come in from towns like Taganrog, Rostov-on-Don, all these border cities that have these massive rail stations, and then they cross over into Ukraine or into what was previously under Ukrainian control, into Luhansk, Donetsk. And then from there, there's a lot of different rail depots throughout Donetsk, Makivka, all of these major cities, Ilovaisk. And then from there, you go a bit to the southwest, and a lot of these rail lines sort of conjoin, especially around Volnovakha, which is a major rail hub. And you do see how it sort of splits off, and then from there makes its way to different parts of Zaporizhia. In terms of the most important cities that have different rail lines that are under Russian control, you have Bilmak, generally around that region. You have Tokmak, especially important. I haven't finished mapping the rail line, by the way. These are just the most important lines that the Russians are utilizing at the moment. And then also Polohi. And so this gave us an idea of the routes the Russians are really relying on in order to continue to defend effectively against the Ukrainians. And something that I have not added yet are the bridges that have been constructed, rail bridges, just road bridges in general, because those are very vulnerable. And if the Ukrainians, and they have in the past, we talked about this, if the Ukrainians are using long range artillery or if they're relying on saboteurs behind the front line to destroy some of these bridges, and that could cause a lot of problems to the Russian forces on the front line that are really relying on a couple of main routes. It wouldn't totally cut off supplies because, again, Zaporizhia is not the same as Kherson. In Kherson, the issue with the logistics is the fact that you had all of this river, this Dnieper River in between the Russian lines and the main Russian communications on the eastern side of the Dnieper River, and then the Russian forces themselves that were on the western side of the Dnieper River. And so it was very difficult to transport heavy equipment, especially, but also reinforcements in general across the river when you had HIMARS firing all over the place, firing onto bridges, causing damage to the bridges, firing onto the ferries, onto the pontoon bridges. Now, with Zaporizhia, it's a much wider space, and sure, you could specifically target key choke points, and they have done that, the Ukrainians. It has led to certain victories, certain minor achievements for the Ukrainians, but those are all temporary in nature. And then again, there's multiple different routes that could still be used that obviously are less ideal. They may take longer. You could also use open fields, obviously. And if you were to use open fields, of course, it will be more difficult to transport a lot of higher volume equipment, but you could still do it and disperse it around a very, very broad line, basically, and get it to the front line, albeit not as well as by using the regular rail lines or using the highways. But anyway, let's get into the actual point of this video. And I want to begin by talking about this very interesting New York Times article, which I want to go through the entire thing and highlight the most important parts about Zaporizhia specifically. And so the New York Times article, it talked about the Ukrainian counteroffensive in Zaporizhia, sort of reflecting on the Ukrainian losses and the way that they've shifted their strategy over the past few weeks, given the results from the initial 2 weeks of the assault. And it started around June 4th, from what we know. And so what the New York Times was saying is that as much as 20% of the equipment that the Ukrainians sent to the front line for the initial attack in the first 2 weeks, at least 20%, or sorry, not at least, as much as 20%, so as a maximum 20%, of that equipment was destroyed or damaged. And that includes a lot of the Western tanks and armored personnel carriers and infantry fighting vehicles that were shipped to Ukraine in lieu of the counteroffensive that, passed through some of these key towns that we have marked over here: Velyka, Veselyanka, There's a few others over here that are near the front line, these key transportation hubs. Then they were moved to Orikhiv, Huliapoli, all of these key hubs near the front line, and then from there dispersed to their respective parts of the front line. And those different armored personnel carriers or vehicles or whatever they may be, they were utilized in the initial 2 weeks in order to secure significant breakthroughs. And we just not see that manifest at the beginning of the counteroffensive when we saw those attacks, for instance, towards Pyatikatki, and we're still seeing them. When we saw those attacks in the direction of Robotyne, when we saw those attacks that were in the direction of Luhivsk and Novopokrovka, that was an especially deadly area for Ukrainian equipment, and also, of course, towards Velyka Novosilka. And I just want to say that it's not like the Ukrainians have given up, but since the initial 2 weeks, the Ukrainians have learned a lot, and they have had to endure some significant losses, as we said, with the 20%. And so Ukraine did really reduce the amount of attacks that they conducted. They did actually reduce the amount of Western weaponry that they utilized in their attacks. They obviously still utilized infantry fighting vehicles, but they reverted back to some of their older Soviet systems because they wanted to preserve all of the Western equipment that they had received. And so the amount of equipment that was destroyed in the subsequent weeks after the first 2 weeks was reduced. It was more like 10% according to the New York Times. And so this is not to say that 30% of all of what Ukraine has in terms of equipment was destroyed in general. It's just saying that within the first 2 weeks of the equipment that was moved to the front line, 20% of it was destroyed. And then in the weeks after that, of the equipment that was moved to the front line, under the 10% was destroyed. But of course, Ukraine does still have a lot of equipment that was shipped in from the West and also from other fronts, of course, that is still available for usage if Ukraine really needed it for whatever reason, for any sort of breakthrough. But let's get back to the article. So what the Western defense officials told the New York Times, and of course they're coming from a very biased perspective, what they're saying is that after those initial 2 weeks, the Ukrainians, they shifted their focus less so on direct head-on assaults through minefields. And by the way, we are still seeing that. I talk about those Ukrainian assaults every single day in my videos. But I do have to admit that I have seen much less of that in the past, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, than I did at the beginning of the counteroffensive. And so that is true. I do have to admit that, yeah, Ukraine has lowered it a little, and they have began focusing more on utilizing their artillery, using long-range artillery in some cases to strike deeper lying targets, trying to engage in counter battery fire, trying to target Russian fortified positions with artillery. So that's been more so of their focus recently than actual on the ground infantry attacks, although those still occur. Now, in terms of the vehicles that now Ukraine is shifting towards, we're seeing more of these BTR-80s, we're seeing some BMPs, and in terms of tanks, we're seeing some of the T-64 main battle tanks. I've seen a lot of those recently in videos popping up across this entire Zaporizhia front. And there's obviously a trade-off to this, because when you begin to transition to the older equipment and when you begin to focus more on artillery, it is sort of a given that you're going to reduce the amount of gains that you secure. And so really the Ukrainians have only been able to advance about 5 miles during this counteroffensive, really depending on where you measure it from. New York Times said 5 miles, but it could be less in certain areas. Like, just take out a measuring stick, the Russian line around Malisy Sherbaki, the Ukrainians pushed there like 2 miles, just for as an example. Around Orikhiv, you could say the Ukrainians, they pushed another 2-3 miles. If we go to Velyka Novosilka, maybe over here you could say, yeah, they advanced nearly 5 miles. So that would be one example of 5 miles. But then again, look at the gap between the front line and between the Sea of Azov. That's what people are concerned about, the possibility of actually reaching that far. And by the way, it might be now the fact that Ukraine has revised its goals for this round of attacks, in that they no longer even want to reach the Sea of Azov. I don't even know if that's the intended goal anymore, given the realities over the past 41 days. But certainly they do want to overrun the Russian defensive lines, the multiple layers that I have mapped out in black. And once they do secure that, if they were able to in the scenario that they could, then at that point it would be easier to traverse the open fields in the southern part of Zaporizhia because there's less Russian prepared defenses over there. So the hard part is right now. But then again, we have to talk about whether they're even going to be able to break through those hard parts because there are multiple major trench lines that still need to be overrun. In some areas, the Ukrainians have reached certain local trench systems that are important, but then the larger ones that are connected over a very wide distance, those ones are still, depending on where you're measuring it from, about 5 miles away from the front line. Now, I'm not the only one talking about the stalling pace of this counteroffensive. Even Zelensky, he acknowledged that there was a slow pace, and he blamed it on the lack of additional deliveries from the West. And then also the Western intelligence officials, they acknowledged that for a certain period of time after those initial 2 weeks, the Ukrainians did pause their, head-on assaults, but that recently those have resumed. And they are saying that now the Ukrainian assaults will be more cautious due to the fact that the Russians have prepared defenses and a lot of minefields in these areas that the Ukrainians are trying to defend or, sorry, advance past. And then what comes to mind for me, at least when I read that, was around Robotyne, where the Ukrainians are trying to find certain areas where there are less mines in order to break through in that area and reach certain key towns across the Russian front line in order to tap into them and try to sort of exponentially increase their gains. But so far, they've not been able to capture Robotyne, and I do have no updates about that town as of today. Now, in regards to the specific numbers of Ukrainian losses, this is very hard to document, but I have seen from Oryx, and the thing about Oryx is that they do have a lot of irregularities in their markings of whether a certain piece of equipment is Russian or Ukrainian. There's dating issues, there's issues with whether there are duplicates in their system, and so it's by no means a perfect account of how many vehicles, how many tanks have been destroyed. So I do have to take every single thing they say with a grain of salt. So it's definitely not something that you should take as gospel. I think a lot of people do, but I think that's a mistake. But I do think it's the best thing that we have just because I haven't seen any other databases that are going through each specific video and trying to compile it. If there is another one, then I'd be interested in finding them and seeing if maybe they have less duplicates because there are people that are actually going through the entire Oryx database and they're catching duplicates and they're pointing them out. So I don't even know how much I can trust it, and I don't know if it's slanted towards Ukraine in a certain way with the amount of equipment that is being labeled as Russian destroyed when perhaps it was Ukrainian equipment that was destroyed. I don't know for sure. But I do know that the New York Times just cited Oryx, so just make of it what you will. But from what they're saying about Ukrainian losses, they're saying that the 47th Brigade, which it's supposed to have been given 99 Bradleys according to those leaked Department of Defense plans from late February. And so, of those 99 Bradleys, and we don't know the status of each one, whether all of them have been sent yet, but of those 99, one-third of the Bradleys have been either damaged or destroyed, and those are supposed to be given to the 47th Brigade, which is located over here. Then, in terms of the Leopards, and there are multiple variations. Most of the Leopards that have been destroyed are 2A4s. There might have been a few that are 2A6s, but mostly 2A4s. So of the 32 that were allotted to the 33rd Mechanized Brigade, about 30% of the Leopards were destroyed or damaged. And again, most of them were destroyed at the beginning of the counteroffensive, not recently, from what I've seen. And so, all in all, the takeaway is the fact that it's not going to be an easy process for Ukraine to break through. It's definitely going to take really months at this point if they even are successful. And I think this is something that I've seen now a lot of people on the Ukrainian side begin to acknowledge that it's not going to be this immediate spearhead through the Russian defense. This is going to be a very methodical process over really a lot of months. And even then, it might not be guaranteed. And there may have to be way more Western shipments. And this sort of leads into what High Commander on the Ukrainian side, Valery Zaluzhny, has said. He's criticized the West, and especially the United States, for their extended process and sort of their stalling in regards to sending F-16s to Ukraine. And so, in terms of F-16s, we've seen the Danish and the Dutch after the Vilnius summit, the NATO summit. They announced that they gathered 11 countries to train Ukrainian pilots on these F-16s. I think that's going to start in August. But in terms of actually sending those F-16s to Ukraine, so it'll be under, their tutelage, the United States is still very hesitant. Right now, the Department of Defense are saying that they don't want to give it yet due to the fact that Russia still has significant air defense capabilities, and they don't want the Russians shooting them down, having access to them, and also depleting American stockpiles. So that's their excuse. It can also be because, maybe the United States is fearing an escalation, or maybe they just want to hold on to it for now. For whatever reason, the F-16s are not going to be sent anytime soon from what we're seeing, unless there's a major shift in the direction of the Department of Defense and the Biden administration. Now, moving on to the actual front line, we saw a video recently which was posted probably from Zaporizhia sector, and I'll actually pull it up for you guys. So here's the clip. And at around the 11th second of the video, I believe, what you can see is there are these bomblets that are airborne and then they begin to disperse. And then, like a second later, they hit the ground. And what people were saying is that those are actually the cluster bombs that were recently sent by the United States, and that these were fired from 155 millimeter shells. And after seeing the video and seeing what other people that are way more knowledgeable on the topic than I am, I'm going to say that I'm not sure, and that I wouldn't jump to conclusions yet about whether these are actually the 155 millimeter DPICMs, because other people have been saying that have expertise in, artillery shells, that it looks like an 120 millimeter mortar round, and it looks like that round would have 24 DPICMs. And in the 155 millimeter DPICMs, you usually have more than that. You have like 76, 88, maybe even more depending on the iteration. But then Turkey, we already know that they have been providing Ukrainians with these DPICMs for really months now, might be even more. And they are coming in the form of these mortars in some cases. And so in this case, it would be from the M971 mortars, and then, firing the 120 millimeter mortar rounds with those cluster bombs. And so this might be something that Ukraine already had at their disposal. And we've already seen Ukrainians use cluster bombs really since the beginning of the war. But the thing about the cluster bombs that are going to be sent from the United States is that they are supposed to have a lower dud rate. Dud rate basically means that the ordnance, it doesn't explode, that still, has the possibility of exploding on the ground if, a vehicle or person gets near it, and then that could cause a lot of problems later on, even after the war is over. And so dud rates are a huge issue. According to the DoD, the DPICMs that they're sending have a 2.35% dud rate. I really don't believe that, because from all the on the ground actual testing that's been conducted by these defense contractors, it usually has like a 10 to 20% dud rate, which is still lower than some of the Russian cluster bombs, but either way, it is still significant. Regardless, what we do know is that the Americans do have stockpiles of cluster bombs in Poland, in all of Eastern Europe. They have these bases that are filled with ammunition, and then they're close to Ukraine for a specific purpose, because they're waiting for the announcements, from the West, from the DoD, that they approve of the movement of these shells, and then they can immediately be moved over the border and quickly sent through Ukraine's rail system to the front line. And so it's not that big of a surprise if we were to see these 150 millimeter shells using cluster bombs being seen at the front line in the coming days, if not already. But that's about it for the more wide situation. I want to zoom in and talk about the specifics for a moment, starting off with Velyka Novosilka. So the 35th Brigade, and it's always a struggle to find these units, but I'm still going to make the effort to find them around here, because there's just so many. It's hard to mix them up. So here's the 35th Brigade. They launched multiple waves of assaults in the direction of Stormayorske and Rozhenie. There's three different areas from which they're attacking. One is from the northwest through the fortified areas that they took over with all the bush lines. So they're attacking from there. They're attacking directly from the north from Storozheve and Makarivka. And then they're also attacking Uruzhenie, mostly directly from the north, but also sometimes from the northeast. And so you have four major vectors of attack. All of them have so far been repelled from what I'm seeing. There's no indication that Oruzhenia has fallen, and that's where we're seeing the heaviest fighting. And from Russian sources, they're alleging that there were two Ukrainian vehicles that were destroyed by mines during this assault, and two by their ATGM crews. And so for now, again, it is stalling. In terms of the situation around Prutny, there has been no head-on attack today, from what I've seen. What we do know is that the 72nd Brigade is wrapping up its artillery barrages on the town, which does indicate that Ukraine does plan to launch an attack towards the town in the future. Now, moving to the Bakhmut sector, again, in terms of the changes to the front line, it is very difficult to say. And I have added a gray zone between the Russian and Ukrainian lines. I do intend to do it across the entire map because I hate how I have it as just with no ambiguity when there really is obviously ambiguity. But what we are seeing is that the Russians are attempting to counterattack from the northwest of Klishchiivka, trying to take over some key fortified heights that Ukraine has under their control. And this is in order to give them a position to hold on to the valley of Klishchiivka, because the Russians in Klishchiivka are located in a valley, so they want to have control of some of the adjacent heights because Ukraine has control over most of them. They already do have control of some of the heights directly to the west of Klishchiivka, but they do want to take over more of them to the northwest to sort of make them be on equal footing with the Ukrainians. So they're trying to attack in this direction with this rectangle from there. The Russian sources, they said that the Russians advanced 500 meters in this direction, and I can't confirm that, so I'm not going to change the map yet. But if they were to have advanced in that direction, then they would be able to secure these key strong points that I have marked with these squares. And that would give the Russians a local dominance that would allow them to, go forward and begin attacking other Ukrainian strong points that are needed in order to launch their attacks onto Klishchiivka. So both sides are beefing up their reinforcements in this area. Russia's moving in a lot of troops to Andriivka, Klishchiivka, and then in terms of Kordiumivka, in this area, there are conflicting reports, which is why I haven't changed the map. Ukrainian sources saying that they have been able to make considerable gains in the direction of Kordiumivka from their new bridgehead across the canal. And the Russians saying that they have been able to repulse all these attacks and that the Russians have been able to inflict significant casualties on the Ukrainians. So I'm not changing that. Now, moving north to the, Kreminna direction. Not many changes, but we do know that the Ukrainians are still trying to take over Dibrova. And it's understandable why, because the Ukrainians have mastered the craft of camouflaging themselves in these forests. They've been able to do that extensively, and the entire southern flank of Dibrova is in the forest. And Dibrova is one of the major forward positions that the Russians are using to conduct their offensive in this area. So I totally get why they're trying to attack, but so far they've been unsuccessful in taking over Dibrova. So for the time being, the Russians are still on the defensive in this sector. When we go a bit to the north, the Russians are still trying to attack. They're now trying to attack in the direction of Yampolivka, but I have no indication that they've been successful so far. We'll update it once we get frontline changes. And then finally, going a bit to the north, we have the Ukrainian forces that are trying to attack in the direction of this town, Karmazhinivka, which is just another one of these towns that's on the Russian front line. And so the Russians, specifically the 21st Motor Rifle Brigade, they utilized their self-propelled artillery and prevented a Ukrainian breakthrough in that area. And the 21st Brigade is over here. So that's all I have for today. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.